All right. Good morning, Alta agents. This is Kevin Lauren, the Director of Training and Marketing. And today we're going to be going through the updates to the car form with Lauren Noack. Before we get into today's presentation, I'm going to bring on Cameron Alley from Clearview Mortgage. Good morning, Cameron. How are you today?
Good morning, Kevin. How are you?
I'm doing great. And let me promote you to panelist, my friend.
Awesome. How was the Christmas party?
The Christmas party was great. Unfortunately, I was under the weather, and
Oh yeah.
and unfortunately, Courtney, my wife, has pneumonia. So been a tough couple of days, but
Oh man.
yeah. So, but the Christmas party, I hear, was a huge success. Great turnout, a lot of fun, and so really appreciate all those that were able to attend.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. So it looks like you should now have full panels control, my friend. Right. Perfect. And you may need to. Oh, there you go.
All right, everybody. So real quick, mortgage update here. Rates are at around a 3-month low today after hitting their peak in late to mid-October. So as you can see here, in the last 3 months, we were kind of where we were in mid-September right now, and obviously peaked in mid-October. And we've been coming down pretty consistently since then. As of right now, on a purchase, just to put everything into perspective for you guys, on a purchase with 760 credit, you can get into a 5.875 for less than a point, which obviously is a huge dramatic improvement from where we were at just a couple months ago. Right now, no points is a 6.384. So obviously huge improvement. Rates have come down about a full percentage point, a little bit more. From the high of about 7.5, if you guys can remember that, from October to the low 6s with no points at all. So kind of to put that into perspective for you, on like just as an example, on an $800,000 purchase with 20% down or even 10% down, that is a savings of about $500 a month as compared to where we were at. So obviously $500 when it comes to qualifying somebody, $500 in liabilities, that's a huge amount. That's like let's say in October, if somebody was trying to buy a house and they didn't qualify, but they had a car payment that was $500 a month, we pay off that car payment. Now all of a sudden they qualify, right? So $500 is quite a bit of money as far as DTI calculations. So chances are that there's a lot of people that maybe you were trying to pre-qual, or a lot of people who maybe didn't qualify, some buyers that you were working with that definitely do now. So keep that in mind. Keep that in your pocket just in case you want to reach out to somebody you were talking to in the past. And also, refinance applications and purchase applications have increased nationwide for the first time in nearly 6 months. So that is definitely good news. Also, as rates have begun to fall and home values have begun to come down, rents have continued to increase. They really haven't slowed down at all. In fact, the rent report that was released last month shows that rent is increasing even faster than it was previously. So that is all a pretty good indicator that around spring and summertime, there's going to be a lot of first-time home buyers, once rates improve even a little bit more, that have been waiting to purchase, that should come out of the woodworks, definitely. So keep your eye on that. And if nobody knows, today is the Fed meeting. So this is always the big day every quarter that we look forward to, where the Fed kind of says what they're going to be doing. They expect to raise rates by 50 basis points rather than 75 basis points, which is what they've been increasing them by every single meeting since the rate increase started. So 25 basis point decrease. So that is definitely good news for the bond market, as I'm sure that we'll see in the coming weeks. But there's now talk that with the cooler than expected inflation report that was released yesterday, that the rate hikes may be done by March. So they were saying like late next year they would stop increasing rates, but we have had 2 inflation reports. The last 2 have been better than expected. So that's going to probably give Chairman Powell some pressure to stop the rate increases quicker than expected. So that would be definitely good news for our part of the industry, obviously. So, but inflation is still at a 70%, 7% range, just to put that into perspective. So it hasn't been a huge increase, but those two inflation reports with basically keeping it down at 7 rather than the high 8s, I guess they will call that a victory. So as long as it is good for us, we'll be happy, right? So also too, wanted to go over the new conforming limits. We did touch on this, I think last month probably, but most of your low cost counties in California now, the limit for 2023 is $726,200. And as you can see here, all of your higher cost counties are about over $1 million now, including the FHA loan limit. So I'll just go through this just real quick a little bit so that you kind of have some perspective. So Contra Costa is about over $1 million now. We got Los Angeles, obviously, you know, places where a lot of us do our business. We got Monterey at 915, Napa at over $1 million, Orange at over $1 million. So obviously, to put that into perspective, conforming limits just 3 years ago were sitting around 700,000 to 800,000. So they've given us a lot of leeway on this, which definitely helps. So definitely look at this, maybe look it up online and save it so that you have that in your pocket and you know what the county limits are. But also too, if you look into this, we've also got the FHA loan limits, right? So a lot of the FHA loan limits in the large counties match the conforming limits as far as conventional. So what that's going to do is help these people get FHA loans. So let's say if somebody in Contra Costa wanted to get $1 million home and they didn't want to do conventional, or maybe they're self-employed and they don't have the best credit, they can use an FHA loan. And obviously the down payment requirement's only 3.5%. So that is definitely helpful, but do look here in some of the lower cost counties, the FHA, excuse me, the FHA loan limit has not been adjusted. So just make sure that you look into that. If you have any questions on it, obviously reach out to me. And then also too, one last thing I wanted to kind of touch on is we do have a Home Ready, Home Possible. I'm sure that some of you have heard of that. Now, obviously in California, we don't get to use this too much because the income limits through Fannie and Freddie are kind of ridiculous. Nobody can really qualify for a home that's making that amount of money, but there is sometimes the possibility that, let's say you have a couple that's purchasing a home, right? And maybe one of them makes about, you know, $80,000 a year, but has no debt. And maybe the other one makes $80,000 a year, but does have debt. You could maybe keep one of them off of the loan and take advantage of a Home Possible, Home Ready. And then you're looking at like a 5.9 with no points. So this is going to be kind of rare. It's not going to be something that you would usually use all the time. This is going to be in like the lower cost counties. It's obviously not going to be in like Los Angeles or Napa or San Francisco or any of those places, but just know that. And if you run into a scenario like that, feel free to reach out and I can give you some information on that because obviously they can get a better rate and have a lower requirement for down payment. So basically Home Possible, Home Ready is like a conventional loan, but they only have to put 3.5% down. So it is similar to like an FHA loan, but they don't have that really high mortgage insurance. But other than that, that's pretty much it for today. Just wanted to give you guys a quick overview and hope everyone had fun at the Christmas party that went. I wish I could have went, but my wife is going to have a baby anytime now, so I couldn't go. But once again, always feel free to reach out if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Cameron. Really appreciate it. And we will have another event very soon. So everybody will be able to get together. Hopefully we'll have another event, I think in either February or March. So keep you guys updated. Always appreciate your insight. Like I said, if you've been listening to Cameron for as long as I have, which has been a couple years now, he seems to have a crystal ball somewhere back there in his office. So continue to listen to him, guys.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it.
You got it, buddy. Okay, perfect. So now I'm going to bring our own Lauren Noack on the line. And good morning, Lauren. How are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing well. All right, and I'm going to make you a panelist, so you're all official.
Woohoo.
All right. And how are you this morning?
I'm doing well.
Okay, good. And we had our Christmas party last night, and I unfortunately wasn't able to make it, and I know you weren't either, but
No. But I'm bummed I missed out for sure.
yep, a good time was had by all, so I was told. All right, so you should have the all-encompassing power of promoter. And once you become a promoter, you do need to unmute yourself. I know it's weird.
Okay, how about that?
That's perfect. All right, kinks
Would
are
have been
out,
a
and
very boring webinar.
oh, totally. We would all just be sitting here very bored. You're right.
Just watching the screen change. Okay. Um, so let me pull up my.
Yeah, so of course we've had some changes to the car forms, and Lauren has been doing her studying as she normally does, and she's up to speed. And so she's going to bring us up to speed with what's going on.
Exactly. So let me share my screen here.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren.
And there we go. Okay.
Perfect.
So I'm here today to talk about the new and revised forms that are going to be released through CAR. And next week, I think, is the goal release date on the 20th, next Tuesday, I believe. So you'll hear about these changes, but you won't see them released through CAR until next week. So keep that in mind. Today I'll be giving a brief introduction and some kind of light housekeeping before we jump into two brand new forms that have been created for this release. And then a bulk of our time will be spent on the 10 revised forms, specifically tweaks made to the residential purchase agreement and what to kind of keep an eye out on. And then we'll wrap it up with the new but also improved buyer representation form sort of suite that they've come out with. The theme of this release is definitely transparency. There's going to be a lot of clarifying, a lot of, excuse me, bringing attention to certain things and making sure that everybody's all on the same page. So that will be interesting. So, but before we jump into all of that, some of you might be new to Alta or new to me and are wondering why I have any business talking on this subject. Like Kevin said, my name is Lauren Noack. I am the owner of the TC Advantage. I'm CAR certified as a transaction coordinator and CAR certified as a forms trainer. So the contracts and paperwork are my jam. That is my wheelhouse. And with my team of 2 full-time TCs, we're set to close over 400 transactions this year alone. So we've seen it all. We're a pretty good resource for all things kind of contracts. I'm also a licensed realtor and your friendly Alta Realty Group compliance officer. So if you've ever wondered who plays red light, green light with your CDAs, that's me. Let's see here.
All the power.
Yeah, right. Let's see. Oh no, I don't know. I hope it doesn't do this the whole time. Let's see. I think it, no, okay. This was a shot of car.org, but basically some of the general factoids about the CAR forms, the updating process, why you should care. The CAR forms are revised and created every June and December. So twice a year, these releases come out. And in between those release dates, CAR's collecting feedback from realtors in the field, collaborating through an advisory committee that's made up of CAR members and attorneys to make all of these kind of necessary changes. They're not instant, but I do think they do a pretty good job of kind of keeping up with this always evolving industry. And you can view the redline versions of the revised forms and drafts of the new forms on car.org. You can also access videos of their live legal webinars. And you can also sign up for some of their upcoming webinars as well. They're very, very good at keeping them to like exactly an hour long. They're very respectful of time. and they're always packed full of information, usually taught by car legal attorneys. There is an upcoming webinar in January on the 10th from 1:30 to 2:30, and that one goes into detail about these buyer representation agreements that we're going to be touching on today. So if you go to car.org and you click on the risk management tab, you can go to tools. You can also find their 1 to 2 page quick guides. And those are really handy either for clients or just for you as an agent in general, just to get a summary of topics like the FERPTA, assignees. And then this month they're doing, next month they're doing guides on when your listing expires, amending property disclosures, the best way to write contingent offers, negotiating repairs, stuff like that. So they're really great little guides that get straight to the point of best practices, risk management, what to look for. And they're really kind of user friendly and easy to view. So we'll jump right into it. The first brand new form that we're going to be covering is the NCOA, or the Non-Contingent Offer Advisory. And this was a much more relevant form maybe like 3 months ago. But like I said, the CAR Forms Committee isn't instant. So they're a little bit delayed with the times, but the non-contingent offer scenario happens a lot more than you might think. So it's good that they have this form and that, we're kind of going over it. You want to note that this is an advisory. So it's not an addendum, it's not a disclosure, it's just a for your information type of form. There's currently the MCA, or the Market Conditions Advisory, that our office requires. But that basically advises both parties about like the conditions of the market. So this is similar to that in that it's providing that kind of FYI summary of what it actually means to submit a non-contingent offer. Because remember, we're not attorneys. We should not be giving any legal advice. So advisories like this that are specific to these types of situations that your clients might be in can really be a powerful risk management tool. And this is just a simple 1-page advisory. It's just for the buyer to sign. This next form is also a new form. It has a super easy form code to remember, and that's the solar form. And this is the solar advisory and questionnaire. So this is a 2-page, again, advisory, where basically the first page outlines all the different types of solar systems, different agreements, types of transfer, that sort of a thing. And then the second page gives the opportunity for the seller to kind of answer more specific solar related questions for the buyer. Again, because it's not necessarily a disclosure, and we'll touch a little bit later how this is actually has become a contractual requirement, where if there is solar, the seller does need to let the buyer know all the information they have about the solar situation. And so this form kind of puts that all into one spot. So I think it'll be really kind of handy to use. The first section of the questionnaire is just sort of your general questions, your solar system information. Do you know who installed it? Is there a backup battery? That kind of a thing. And then the next section, 6B, is for solar systems that are seller owned. And then 6C is if the solar panels are leased. So those last two, it's whichever one applies. That would be the section that's completed. And now keep in mind, this is not a disclosure. Again, this is just an advisory, but the information is contractual. Like I said, this section on the contract does require the seller to provide all known information about the solar panels or solar system. So I think this will be really helpful. The questions are formatted like the TDS and the SPQ in an "are you aware of" style. So don't let the seller kind of get overwhelmed by all of these things. If they're aware of it, great, give us the info. If not, just answer no. This is all in the name of transparency, right? So making sure there's no surprises. It might trigger somebody's memory of like, oh yeah, I do actually know that they wouldn't have generally offered up in just a sort of email or transfer of paperwork. Okay, so those aren't all of the brand new forms. Those are kind of the new one-offs. The other new forms center around the buyer representation agreement. So we're going to circle back to that whole, like I said, suite in just a bit. But right now we're going to talk about some of the revisions and tweaks made to existing forms that, even though they're kind of small changes or additions, they could potentially derail a transaction if you're not aware of them. First up are changes made to the RPA, the residential purchase agreement. And keep in mind, these changes are made across all of the purchase agreements as well, but we're just going to focus on the RPA because that's what we use the most. Thankfully, they were able to make all of these changes without adding any more pages to this already obnoxiously long 16-page contract. So we are grateful for that. So this is the first change, and just a reminder that this financing section with the loan rate and terms is required to satisfy the statute of frauds. But it's still one of the most common sections that I see incomplete. And even with agents that are on the listing side, if you receive your offer and this isn't complete, I see it all the time. So for this revision, you can kind of see in the bottom section what the current contract looks like. And then above in red are just the really simple changes that they made. And you'll start to see these on the purchase agreement next week. So currently, the contract defaults to 0 points. And the reason that they did this was because people kept leaving it incomplete, right? And so this was their effort to just say, okay, the default is going to be 0 points. But then after some feedback and review, it was determined that 0 just was not a realistic number. And the committee couldn't really agree on a better default amount. So they went back to a blank line. And this means in order to complete this section properly, you need the loan amount, the interest rate max, right, not to exceed, and the points default amount. So if you're a listing agent and you don't see this information on an offer that you've received, put it in a counteroffer. The information here are the parameters for the loan contingency. So you want to make sure that it's complete. Again, I've said it before on the buyer side, so that you want to make this as tight and specific as possible so that if you only qualify for maybe a loan that's more or higher, you have a valid reason to cancel based on the loan contingency. And on the listing side, one, if it's blank, you want to make that as broad as possible so that the buyer, even if they end up with this higher payment than they wanted, is still contractually obligated to close the transaction. They can't cancel based on the loan contingency. So it's a really important section. It was also reorganized with those bullet points because, as you can see from the current section in that box, the section for the initial, like the box where you can check if it's an initial adjustable rate, it makes it look like all the information not to exceed section only applies like if you check that box. So it was kind of misleading. So they broke it up in the lines, added the bullet points, again, aiming for clarity. Okay, and again, we'll touch on this more when we go over the buyer representation forms, but there is this new section in the grid where you can check a box in the contract that asks the seller, not the listing broker, right? The seller specifically, the buyer is asking the seller to pay for the difference between the commission offered by their listing agent and what the buyer agreed to pay the buyer's broker in that separate representation agreement. So typically a buyer broker agreement might say like the buyer agrees to pay the buyer's broker 3%. They open escrow on a property, but the listing broker is only offering 2.5%, right? So then the buyer would be responsible for paying that additional 0.5%, so that regardless, the buyer's agent walks away with their 3% commission. This checking this box and submitting the subsequent forms that go along with it, this allows the buyer to ask the seller if they will cover that 0.5%. So in doing so, the seller is now entitled to a copy of the buyer's representation agreement, right? Since that was something previously between just the buyer and the buyer's broker, but now they've brought the seller into it. And so now the seller is able to see a copy, or is entitled to a copy of that agreement.
And
Something to
Lauren,
keep
I
in.
think we have a question. I think you just answered it, but
Yeah.
Albert asks, what about the seller buying the rate?
Like in the form of a credit.
I
think
think so. If you want to clarify that, Albert.
that might be different. This is in an effort, I think, for more transparency. And we'll get into it more as far as like what they're really leaning towards in disclosing commissions, disclosing what agents will be making, what buyers agents will be making commissions wise.
Right.
So I think this is geared more towards commissions specifically, because when you tie the compensation, it's typically in exchange for services, right? So this then shifts those expectations and that liability on what you're getting for what you're paying for, basically, and who your loyalties are with now if the seller is paying some of this. So these are really specific to commissions.
Got it.
And also, this is not to modify the commission received from the buyer's broker. This is really important, right? So this is the buyer asking the seller to pay. And if you, as the buyer's agent, would like to receive a higher split from the listing agent or listing broker, right? Because this is technically broker to broker, you would use the CBC form, cooperating broker compensation. So let's say, I know a lot of listings, sometimes listing agents will take a 3.5% and, give maybe 2% or 2.5% to the buyer's agent, right? So on the MLS, the buyer's agent can say, okay, I want 3%. So reduce what the listing agent is getting and increase what the buyer's agent is getting. That's not what this is saying. Whatever the listing agent's commission split is going to be, that has no effect on this. This is asking the seller to pay that dollar amount difference. It's sort of a what do you have to lose scenario, right? Like it's just like, well, sure, throw it in there. Like same thing with the seller credit, right? Just ask, like put it in there, I guess. So they created this whole section, and again, we'll kind of go over that in more detail here shortly. Okay, so this next part is so important that they really wanted to revamp the verbiage and expand upon when the use of this TOPA form, the tenant occupied property addendum, when it does and does not apply. It also gives more explanation and sort of fallout for the seller if they don't comply properly. So in regards to possession, this says occupied units by tenants or anyone other than the seller. And then there's a checkbox that if that is the case, you check the box that the TOPA form applies. And then in the additional terms, it clarifies again, seller shall disclose to buyer if occupied by tenants, and this is important, or persons other than the seller, and attach the TOPA form in a counteroffer if it's not part of the buyer's offer, right? The buyer may not necessarily know when they're filling out this contract to check that box, but this section notifies the seller, hey, if this isn't checked and this applies, then you need to do a counteroffer to include and attach this TOPA form. And it's really easy to only think of a sort of landlord-tenant situation, but maybe the seller's son is living in the guest house. Maybe they moved back home after college and they're living on the property, maybe paying, kid to parent rent. Maybe a man lives with his fiance, but the house is only in his name, right? Do you need to use this TOPA form? Yeah. Risk management best practice, you want to include this form. These are people that are not the seller. If there's roommates, and then you're selling this property. So this is a form that is not used as much as it should be. And then it expands in further on in the contract in section 7A, and it gives a course of action for basically if this is for multi-unit properties, if the seller doesn't provide the TOPA, if that doesn't end up being incorporated into the transaction, then whichever unit the buyer intends to occupy, if that's the case, right? If it's a primary or secondary residence, whatever unit the buyer intends to occupy, the seller is responsible for delivering that unit vacant. It has to be vacant, and the buyer then gets to pick which unit they want to occupy, and they notify the seller within 3 days of acceptance. So if you receive an offer on, let's say, a duplex, right? And there is, you have a tenant in one unit, the other unit is vacant, but the one the tenant's in is maybe better, and this TOPA form does not get incorporated into the contract. This says that the buyer can then say, I want, within 3 days, notify the seller in writing, I would like to occupy this unit. And then the seller is obligated to provide that unit vacant, even if it's not the one that was intended. So this is very serious. They could have very serious repercussions here. And it's really important to utilize this TOPA form, even if the property or the units will be delivered vacant upon closing. You still have to use this form. Are there any questions about this? I think there might be.
Right.
It's one of those little kind of slipped in there things, but it's attempting to clarify this situation that's kind of already been in effect. But again, because this hasn't been used properly or effectively, a lot of people are saying, oh, well, the box wasn't checked, so it's not a part of the contract, right? And so it's like,
Right.
no, if it wasn't checked, maybe the buyer didn't know, maybe the buyer missed it. It's now on the seller and this listing side to say, hey, this applies. We have to incorporate this form. Even if maybe you have a fourplex and it's going to be, all units are going to be delivered vacant. Maybe when the offer was written, 1 or 2 units were occupied, but when escrow closes, they're all going to be delivered vacant. So nobody's going to be occupying it. Doesn't matter. You still have to use this form and check the box that says all units will be delivered vacant.
And then Albert just asked, what happens if they're in a contract?
Yeah, that super sucks. And that creates a lot of liability for the seller.
100%, right?
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying is that it's really important that you make sure that this gets clarified, because then it can also have an effect on the buyer's, financing. And, there can be sort of a trickle down repercussions there as well. It can really throw a wrench into things. And so it's so important that on the listing side, you're not relying on, whatever is being submitted to you. Like, oh, I guess the buyers don't care which unit, or I guess they don't care if they're vacant or occupied or whatever. So like, that's on them. No, actually now it's on the seller, and it can really cause issues. So it's important to know what's in the contract. Okay. The last grid element, and again, the grid is that section 3, the first 3 pages of the contract. The last one that was updated is in section Q18, so 3Q18, regarding the home warranty. There was still some ambiguity up front about who was responsible. And so they added some kind of additional verbiage in here to clarify. You can see in the top section of what it looks like currently. But they wanted to, again, clarify the default is that the buyer picks the plan and any additional coverage, whether it's written on that line or not, right? The buyer gets to pick. If the cost for that plan or coverage exceeds the amount, if they're asking the seller to pay any part of it, whether split the cost with them or pay it entirely, if the cost of any of that plan and coverage exceeds the amount, then the buyer is automatically responsible for that cost. There's no addendum needed. So the buyer isn't thinking, oh, I'm going to add on this and add on that, and then the seller's just going to pay for that because they agreed to this plan and coverage that we wrote into the contract. That's not the case. The not to exceed is not to exceed. The buyer that
Oops, looks like we lost you there. Lauren, hello? I'm not sure what happened to your audio, Lauren, but we can no longer hear you. Testing. Yeah, we still can't hear you for some reason. I see that you're not muted, but somehow we lost you. All right, so Lauren's gonna have to log back in here. 1 second, guys. Sorry about that. We'll give Lauren a sec here. Really good stuff. Lauren always brings such an amazing amount of knowledge. She really knows these forms. If you have questions, of course, she is our go-to person. So we'll let her reestablish her connection and get her back on the line here. See if I can find her. Okay, she just sent me a text that the power just went out. That's always fun. So we'll give her a sec here. Everybody, grab another cup of coffee. You know, these webinars, live webinars, they work so well until they don't. So let's see if we can have Lauren reestablish her connection here. You can't get online if you don't have power, so it might take a second. I'm sure she has to reboot her computer. Hopefully her power comes on quickly. If not, of course, we'll just have to connect next week, but I'm sure she will. Just be a sec here. Well, in the meantime, I just want to remind everybody that you are able to download our ARG app if you haven't done so already. What I'll do is I'll make sure that I put that download on the replay when we send out the replay video today. And so the app is available on Android as well as iPhones now. So everything's been working pretty well. We've got quite a few people that have downloaded the app, and I'd really like to have more people download the app. So, and Lauren is back.
okay, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. You can't do much when the power goes out, right?
Sorry. I sometimes I'm looking at my house and we're like, okay.
Oh, and Lauren, your audio is doing something weird now too.
No.
Sound like you're in a tunnel. All right, good. You are a panelist still.
Okay, is that better?
Much better.
Okay, good. Oh my goodness.
All right.
So sorry. You would think
right.
that I had a grip on this after all these years of pandemic working from home. Okay.
Well, like you said, you can't do much when your power goes out.
Okay. So, does anybody remember where I cut out?
It was right about here.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I'll just start again on this slide then. I think this revision is super important. It closes a loophole that's currently in the contract. Like I said, currently there is a paragraph 3 at the bottom of section 12, and that just lists the delivery and review of any reports, disclosures, or information prepared by or for the seller and delivered to the buyer, right? But because this full paragraph 12 is referenced in the investigation contingency, it meant that the review of seller documents contingency was not separate anymore. And it's actually its own separate contingency. And I've talked about this before, but a lot of agents just don't realize how many contingencies there are and how they can be used in a transaction. So I still see a lot of agents write in their counteroffers, shortening the inspection contingency. There is no inspection contingency. There's an investigation contingency, and the investigation contingency, as you can see here, of physical attributes, any other matters affecting the property. So you could say like a physical inspection contingency, that might be a little bit more direct. And there is that section on the contingency removal form. But a lot of agents use inspection contingency and assume it means basically all contingencies except the loan and the appraisal contingency. There are more than 3 contingencies in the contract. So it's really important that you're as specific as possible on which contingencies those are. I also see a lot agents saying buyer to complete home inspections within 7 days, of acceptance or whatever. And then 7 days go by and they are asking for a contingency removal. And it's like, no, that's not what that term is that you wrote in there. I know that's what your intent was, but that's not what that means. So it's really important for everybody to understand what the contingencies are and what they include, because there is currently this sort of really broad language, whereas you could say, oh, the investigation contingency removed in 7 days, but the review of seller documents is 12 days. Well, if you remove the buyer's investigation, it includes all the seller documents. So you don't have 12 days, it gets removed with this investigation contingency removal. Does that make sense? It's kind of convoluted the way it is right now. It's like I said, this like loophole where it's like, you can remove it earlier. You can say investigation contingency 12 days and review of seller documents 7 days. That would be fine. But if you remove the investigation, then you would remove all of that other thing. So this attempts to close that loophole. It just removed this whole paragraph as being part of section 12. And then they also added into or clarified that included in the buyer's investigation contingency, it's not just a home inspection, maybe a termite inspection, right? It's also all of the other buyer's due diligence, checking Megan's Law, making sure you qualify for homeowners insurance, seeing if the property needs flood insurance or additional fire insurance. That is all included in this investigation contingency. So again, just because you deliver disclosures with the offer or have a short turnaround time on disclosures, and then you think, oh, we signed disclosures, we can remove the investigation contingency. That's not all that it includes. So pay really close attention to that. The other revision is that they added, again, these are all so tiny, but have big impact. They added nomination. So the forms committee heard that a lot of contracts were being written with or nominee added to the buyer's name, and agents were using that interchangeably with assignee. So sometimes you'll see, John Smith or assignee, or they would say John Smith or nominee. Nominee and assignee are 2 different things, but they were being used interchangeably in the contract. So they just added nominee into this clause, and basically whether you say assignee or nominee, they both have to go through that same process, where you need the seller approval, you need to use the AOAA form, The new parties have to acknowledge all prior documents, etc. I don't know what the difference is. Don't ask me. That's a lawyer question, but whichever phrase gets used, same process. I'm most excited about this one because hopefully it will cut down on the amount of the DITA forms that we have to generate from this section being incomplete. You can see that currently the only space for an agent to add their email address and their phone number was in this designated electronic delivery address section, right? The DITA section. And because of the legal implications of this information, CARS stopped syncing with MLS and it wasn't auto-populated, which meant that it always gets left off of the contract, especially for the agent on the other side. And then it's this whole big mess. And then the mailing address for the broker is hidden even underneath that, which sometimes we're lucky that gets auto-populated, but it usually always gets missed. So now you can see they made a full contact section where the agents sign, fill out their broker's address, fill out their contact information, and then, and I believe this will now resync with the MLS. And then all you guys have to do is check a box. So for the designated electronic delivery address agreement, you just check a box under the contact information to designate which address constitutes or that you're accepting electronic delivery for. And you can check whatever emails listed above. That's where you should deliver, documents, notices, information. Send a text message to the phone number above. That's where you should send it. If you want to check a box that says alternate, that can be an alternate email address. If you have maybe an assistant or a general inbox, that, maybe MLS will auto-populate like offers at whatever agent.com, but you want any contingency removals, anything transaction specific, you want to check the box that says alternate and say, no, John Smith at agent.com or whatever your specific email address is. So that's how that new section will be used. And that's what we'll be looking for. Just please don't forget to just check a box. Otherwise, then we have to draft that whole separate DITA form again. So they tried to make it as user-friendly as possible, but you want to make sure that you're looking here and that you're checking this box when you're the buyer's agent. And then when you're the listing agent, one, make sure the buyer's agent checked a box. And two, as the listing agent, make sure that you are also checking a box along with signing and dating the purchase agreement. Okay, these changes are also made to the purchase agreements, but they don't really need a screenshot of all of the text and every single one. So I just listed them here. But don't think that just because these changes are, again, tiny, that they don't have a big impact. For example, in paragraph 9B in the contract, this specifically adds curtain rods and any associated hardware to the list of window coverings included in the sale. So section 9B talks about what's included. I think 9C is what's excluded or whatever. But this says specifically, or currently it says, window coverings, drapes, curtains, blah, blah, blah. For some reason, they also now have to specify also the rods, also any associated hardware, hooks, whatever, for the window coverings. Those are all included. Make sure your sellers are aware of that. And then also in section 25, this is where all the definitions are in the contract. This is a really powerful reference section for things as mundane as days or the word accepted. Those are all defined in section 25. So section I, this section talks about counting days, right? This determines all the due dates for things like contingency removals and specifically close of escrow. And common knowledge has been that if an action is required, meaning removal of contingency or close of escrow, if an action is required and that date falls on a weekend or a legal holiday, it automatically moves to the next day. Well, now they've added, what is a legal holiday? Is it a federal holiday? Is it a city holiday? Is it a state holiday? What is a legal holiday? And that's clarified. And it also says that in regards to close of escrow, any day the escrow holder or the lender is closed automatically pushes the close of escrow date to the next day. Currently, it's if the county's recorder's office is closed, then your close of escrow date goes to the next day. But there are some counties and situations where maybe the escrow company is closed, but the county recorder's office is open. If escrow is closed, close of escrow date goes to the next day. Again, I recommend that you visit car.org and you look at this red line version of the contract. And when I'm done with the whole presentation here, I will show really quickly how to get to that for those that are interested. But you can see, again, in red, what all of these changes are, and it's really helpful. Okay, so that was it for the purchase agreement revisions. Now I'm going to go run through the other CAR forms that have been revised. So the other ones that are in existence, but we've made some changes and tweaks. First is to counteroffers. This section is for what buyers are willing to cover the difference between, so this is kind of attempting to close this appraisal gap, right? And it's what buyers are willing to cover between the sale price and the appraisal amount up to a certain amount. So in the grid, there is this section that's often underutilized, and it's section 3L2 in the grid. You can see the box up there. This is, most people focus on the number of days for the appraisal contingency removal, but you can also write in a dollar amount for a minimum purchase price of if the buyer's willing to say, you know, we write this offer for 500,000, but if the appraisal comes in as low as 480,000, we'll pay the difference. If it comes in at 490, great, we'll pay the $10,000 difference. You get it. So the counteroffers have been revised to include a paragraph in section 1. Again, this is one of the most overlooked sections of all the documents, I feel like. But this says that the dollar amount the buyer was willing to pay over the appraised value doesn't change, even if the sale price does. So this section is important. I'll touch on it. This section 1 of this is on all counteroffers: seller counter, multiple counter, buyer counter. There is this section 1, items A and B currently, and now there will be C. But the first is that liquidated damages and arbitration don't apply to this contract if they aren't initialed by both parties. And that's something that is really often overlooked. Sometimes agents will write in on the counteroffer like, oh, buyer to go back and initial the liquidated damages or arbitration. Or from the buyer's perspective, if you receive a fully executed contract back and the seller hasn't initialed those sections, it doesn't apply. So they both have to be initialed in order to apply. B, the dollar amount for the initial deposit and the increased deposit, and now they've modified it to also include any seller credits, that does not change based on the purchase price. So if your deposit is 3% of the purchase price, and then you increase your offer amount, it doesn't, your deposit doesn't then become 3% of whatever that accepted amount is. It's still whatever that dollar amount was that was listed in the offer, unless otherwise countered out specifically in the counter offer. And that's something that escrow and a lot of agents miss, and they'll tell their buyer, oh, okay, now you need to wire 3% for your deposit. And that's actually not the case. So, but the intent of this specific change is for this, you know, what's called the appraisal gap. So this is important for sellers to understand, because now the threshold for this appraisal contingency just widened. And you can kind of see here in the example, like I said, the original offer price is 500,000. The buyer has written in they're willing to pay the difference for an appraisal that goes as low as 480,000. So that's a $20,000 difference. Let's say they counter sale price back and forth. Final sale price ends up being 550. Then you deduct that $20,000, that dollar amount of that appraisal gap, and you're left with 530,000. This means that if the appraisal comes in at anything 530 or above, the buyer will cover that difference. If it's lower than 530, the buyer can cancel based on the appraisal contingency. So the seller might be thinking, oh, cool, the appraisal came in at 500,000, then the buyer's going to make up this difference because they said anything under 480,000. That's not the case. It's only 20,000 under, because that was the dollar amount that they initially agreed to pay. I know that's really confusing and I wish I had a better way to explain that. But it's just kind of one of those things where you just sort of have to write it down on paper to like really understand that breakdown.
No, for sure.
It sounds more complicated than it actually is.
Correct.
So that's the counteroffer. The next one is the extension of time amendment. So this used to be extension of time addendum, but it makes sense that it's an amendment because we're not adding terms to the contract, we're amending pre-existing terms. So it's been renamed the extension of time amendment. And now it's also included an expiration element to this amendment, which I think is perfect. This needed it. Because I know personally in my TC business on the listing side, we request the contingency removal from the buyer's agent and we'll say, if you're not ready or able to remove this contingency at this time, please submit an extension of time amendment for consideration, right? Then we'll get the extension of time from the buyer's agent and the seller's like, I don't want to give them that much time. I want to give them different time or whatever. So, or they don't want to respond at all. So now there's an expiration element attached to these amendments. And sometimes they might propose maybe an extended close date and they're like, oh, we'll just throw this out there. We're waiting to hear back from the lender on a more specific close of escrow date. And so then more time goes by. Now this is expired. Now you need to do a new one to have a more specific time frame. So I think this will be really helpful. The other form updated is the cancellation of contract. Again, we're going for clarity here. So this very first line reminds everyone that only one party needs to sign section 1. You can unilaterally cancel the contract. However, if you're proposing a mutual cancellation, like both sides want to get out of this, mutual cancellation, then both parties are going to need to sign in that top section 1. Section 2 is separate. That addresses the escrow deposit. So anything having to do with money always requires approval from both parties. So you can unilaterally cancel, one party can cancel the contract, and then both parties need to sign and agree on what to do with the deposit. They also added an expiration element to this proposed mutual cancellation as well, which is really nice because sometimes you have those situations where the buyer reverses course, or maybe the seller has a change of heart and it hasn't been fully executed. So you can still have a valid contract, right? Sometimes it's like the buyer submits this, like, hey, let's do a mutual cancellation. I don't think I'm going to get this loan. I'm not going to be able to move this money around. My other home sale is not going to be able to sell in time, whatever the reason. Here's mutual cancellation. And then before that gets fully executed, it turns out, oh, wait, actually, we can still move forward. Instead of having to redo this whole thing with the same buyer and the same seller and all the same terms or whatever, it's just expired and everybody can move on, which is great. The revisions to the MHPA or mobile home purchase addendum incorporated the terms. They were like, oh, we have this separate MHA or manufactured home advisory addendum, and we'll just merge them together. So now all you need is the MHPA form, which is really nice. And it lays out the standards required for occupancy based on the health and safety code. So what is required by health and safety in order to occupy the mobile home or manufactured home. And then it also explicitly states that the licensed real estate agent or manufactured home dealer are required to conduct a visual inspection. Okay, and now the final act. This topic is very polarizing for a lot of agents. Many are terrified of these forms. Others don't know how to use them. But whatever the reason, they're not used a lot. And CAR really wants to change that. And I think because of the NAR lawsuit about whether the seller should be forced to pay the buyer's agent's commission, there's now the new law of disclosing that commission, buyer's commission amounts. that will be coming into play. They really kind of put CAR on this path to try and get ahead of it with all of these forms, trying to remove the stigma or the fear around using them. If they become a normal part of the buying process, then there's going to be a lot more transparency, and it'll be kind of more normal to just have these conversations. Nobody really likes to talk about this stuff. So here we go. There currently are 3 buyer representation agreements. Those are all gone. Those 3 are now being replaced with this new form, the BRBC, Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. This form is all about transparency and, again, setting those expectations. There's also the anticipated broker compensation disclosure. And again, we'll get into each of these specifically, but this is kind of an overview. It's a really interesting concept to implement, as well as the SPBB, or Seller's Payment to Buyer's Broker, which we touched on earlier in those purchase agreement revisions. Then the cancellation of buyer representation, that one's replacing the termination of buyer agency. And the notice of broker involved properties is replacing the notice of identified properties. And then finally, you have a BTA, or buyer transaction advisory. That's exactly that. It's an advisory for the buyer about what they can expect from their agent and what their obligations are as the buyer in this representation agreement. Okay, so CARD tried to make this form as friendly as possible and address a lot of the common roadblocks agents encounter when presenting this form to their clients. So, for example, there's a start date for the agreement, but there's no hard date for expiration. It's just you fill in a number of days. Typically, agents make, the agreement like a year-long contract, right? And it's daunting for a buyer to be like, oh, I want to be committed to you for this whole period of time. And now you can just say, hey, for the next 60 days, the next 180 days, you can put 365 days if you want to, but there's just a number of days. And if you need to extend that time, you can use an extension of time amendment or modification of terms form to extend this representation period. Also, the default of this form is that it's a non-exclusive agreement, meaning that there has to be work performed by the agent in order to receive any compensation. Sending the buyer, it literally says sending the buyer a list of available properties does not entitle you to compensation. You have to do a little bit more work than that. It also asks right off the bat if they're working with anyone else. Your time is valuable, and you should know if your buyer is playing the field. This also relates to the NAR Code of Ethics. There should be no trampling on anybody else's business. So this is the buyer saying, no, they're not, or yes, they are, here are the people. There's also a few different options to define the type of properties covered under this agreement. You don't want to be too narrow. You don't want to be too vague. And so you can list specific cities, counties, price ranges, all of it, some of it, but just keep that in mind of what will be enforceable later on if things go south and you need to say, hey, I showed you this property or properties like this or whatever. You want to make sure that you're covered. This section of the form outlines the compensation, but it's entirely optional. So even in the name of the form, it's a buyer representation agreement and a broker compensation agreement. Currently, it's all as one, which is one of the reasons people are kind of afraid to use it. It's entirely optional, so it's not required in order to make this agreement valid if it's not filled out. Just note that if you don't fill anything out, then nothing is owed to you. So you can skip over it, or you want to make sure that you fill it out correctly. This also breaks down and gives the buyer clarity on what sort of work the agent will be doing for them. If you ever have trouble articulating your value to buyers or explaining to them what you are doing, you're not just opening doors for them. You're not just emailing them MLS listings. This is a really great section to kind of go over with them and break down all the things that you're doing for them. As I mentioned before, the default is that this contract is non-exclusive, but you have an option to check the box to make it exclusive. It also outlines what that means, making it exclusive. Basically, you get paid regardless, whether you get involved in showing them a property or not, or writing an offer on a property or not, you get paid. To further ease the buyer's mind, it didn't show up on this one either. Okay. To further ease the buyer's mind, the agreement can be canceled at any time by either party. If you have a non-exclusive agreement, the cancellation is effective immediately. If you have a non-exclusive agreement and you deliver this cancellation, it's effective immediately. Then you have 5 days to deliver a list. There's a separate form that basically outlines the properties you were involved with. If you have checked the box and made this an exclusive agreement, then cancellation takes effect 30 days after the cancellation. And then there's a section D that basically says any commission offered by a co-op agent is credited towards the amount the buyer agrees to pay. So the default is that the buyer authorizes the agent to include in their offers a request to the seller to pay any commission difference, which we previously referenced, right? So this just says, yes, you can ask the seller to pay this difference. And then similar to the listing agreement, there's a protection period that says, if you cancel this agreement and then open escrow with someone else on a property I did work on within this time, then you owe me compensation. This only applies if you then provided that list of specific properties. Okay, section F requires the broker to disclose either prior to writing an offer on a property or prior to showing a property what the expected compensation will be to the buyer's broker. There's a separate form. It's new. It's the ABCD form, which sounds made up, but we'll go over that one next. Or you can simply provide the buyer with an MLS printout that shows the compensation amount being offered. Then the broker must also state what the final compensation amount ends up being. Section 6, again, sets the expectations and lists the actions that the broker is responsible for, what the buyer is responsible for. It's really helpful to kind of review that in detail as well. And finally, this agreement will be bundled with all of the other standard buyer agreement forms, your agency agreement, wire fraud advisory, fair housing, all of that stuff, and then the new buyer transactional advisory. And then the signature section is also like the other agreements, where if you have an entity buyer, they can sign accordingly, so they don't have to do an RCSD separate form for representative capacity. Okay, the ABCD form. So this feels like the ultimate confidence test for any agent, because it really lays out what the commission amount actually ends up being. And a lot of agents kind of feel this sets them up for their clients to request credits or having to justify their value to their clients, like you're making so much, blah, blah, blah. Regardless, this form has been created. They're hoping there'll be kind of that shift in the industry, that this will be more of the norm. And again, when you use this representation agreement, this form is incorporated and is required. But just a side note, it is not required by statute or by law yet. So it is a contractual element in this agreement. Basically, it just explains to the buyer that paying out commissions is a common factor for sellers in their bottom line, and it might affect the price that they're willing to accept. And so that's why you'll see a fluctuation in commissions offered. And then there's a spot you can list up to 6 properties. And this is whether you've physically shown the property to the buyer or you've written an offer on the property, the date the property was shown or offer was written, the amount of commission, whether it's a percentage or a flat fee being offered, and then where you got that information about the commission, whether this is what was posted to the MLS or this was provided on a CBC, the cooperating broker compensation form, if it's an off-market listing, or some other source. Then at closing, the agent fills out the bottom portion of this form after all the credits and the price adjustments, et cetera, and lets the buyer know what the final amount was that they were paid. And then the buyer can initial at the bottom or not. So it'll be really interesting to kind of see this in action and implemented. This next form is what's provided to the seller when that box on the RPA is checked, asking them to pay the difference. And it lets the seller know what the buyer agreed to pay, what the listing broker is offering, and then what the difference between those two are that the seller is then being asked to pay. And it also gives permission for the seller to see that written agreement between the buyer and the buyer's broker. And then the most important factor for the seller to be aware of is that if this is a dual agency transaction, and in your listing agreement with the seller, maybe you say 5% total commission, 2.5% each side, but 4% total commission if it's a dual agency, right? If I bring the buyer, represent both sides, 4%. This section says that whatever is in the MLS is what the compensation will be for the buyer's agent, despite that reduction agreement, in order for the seller to cover this difference that they're being asked to cover, if that makes sense. So if you were offering 2.5% in the MLS, but because it's dual agency, you still would be receiving 2% for the listing side, but still 2.5% for the buyer side is what would be paid. And then half of that would go to cover this difference for the buyer. Again, it's going to take some mind wrapping about all of these concepts. So this is the cancellation form for the BRBC, this buyer representation broker compensation agreement. And either the buyer or the broker can cancel it. This is another kind of peace of mind element. As we already discussed, the effective date of cancellation is either immediate when it's a non-exclusive agreement, or 30 days after receipt when it's an exclusive agreement. It also states the agency obligation is dissolved, so the buyer is made aware that the broker will not be acting as their agent once canceled. And then as far as any compensation goes, if the broker is entitled to any per the agreement, there needs to be documented broker involvement and a list of properties provided to the buyer within 5 days of receipt. We keep kind of harping on this of like, show your work. You need to be tracking all of this work that you're doing for the buyer under this agreement. And then the cancellation can either be signed unilaterally or per mutual agreement. But what's important to note is this is actually a 2-page document. And so it's kind of misleading to have all of these signatures here on page 1. But there is a page 2, and page 2 goes into more detail about the compensation owed. So if that part does apply, then you would fill that out. But both pages still need to be signed regardless. And so there are a few options for receiving compensation. This payment, you have option A, which is the amount that was agreed upon for the work that was done on the properties that were provided on this list. Another option is just, look, we're going to cancel this agreement, just reimburse me for my expenses. Option C, the broker will just receive a referral fee instead of trying to split all of this stuff. Just give me a straight referral fee. Option D, the broker will get paid from the seller. Maybe it's a dual agency, or you cancel this representation agreement. I'm going to get my money from the seller anyway. They're still going to pay the full amount. Don't worry about it. Then you have option E, which is just nobody owes anybody anything. Just go in peace. And then option F only applies if your buyer agreement has been made exclusive. And it's that you receive compensation on any subsequent property made during this representation period, regardless of if you did work on it or not. So those are the options. And then the second to last one is the NBIP, which, funny side note, while they were creating all of these forms, previously it was called the broker or notice of involved properties, but then the acronym was NIP, and they were like, no, we're not mature enough for that. So then they added broker. So this is the notice of broker involved properties. And a lot of avenues for broker compensation that we've talked about revolve around providing the buyer with a list of these properties that the broker was involved in on the buyer's behalf. And so this is the form that you use to do that. You can list the properties. You can check a box that says see attached list as well. You really need to stay on top of your agreements though, because if they expire, if this representation agreement expires, then this needs to be provided at the time the agreement expires. However, if you cancel the agreement in writing, then you have up to 5 days to deliver this to the buyer. And again, delivering this will determine compensation and all of that stuff as well. If the buyer decides to do another representation agreement with another broker, then the buyer is required to provide this form to that new broker. And this lets the buyer know that as well. And then our final form for today is the BTA, or the Buyer Transactional Advisory. It's bundled with this BRBC and it's informational only. It's kind of like a mix between the Buyer Inspection Advisory and the agency disclosure, in that it really breaks down what the buyer's obligations are and then what the agent's duties are. And so again, this is just for the buyer to sign. It gets bundled in with everything else. And then just to wrap it up, there are also a slew of new property management forms that have been released, or that will be released next week. But I did not go into those because they're kind of their own beast. And so I really would recommend, there is a webinar in January through Car Legal that will go over all of those forms in detail. The one thing to note about the forms, as far as the residential lease agreement and the month to month. So the name of the form, that whole residential lease and month to month agreement, currently the acronym is LR, and they changed the acronym to reflect the name of the form. So now it's the RLMM, residential lease month to month, RLMM. So if next week, before you go through the webinar and you need to pull up that form and you're like, I can't find it, it's not here anymore, that's because they changed the acronym. So you can search by the actual name of the document or the new acronym, the RLMM. And that's all I've got.
Is that all, Lauren?
Still awake or has any questions?
No, really, really good stuff. I mean, this is all so important as realtors to be able to navigate these forms. And then, of course, they like to, throw a little wrench in your spokes while you're driving and change things up every couple months here. So anyway,
Exactly.
we need somebody like you, Lauren, to help us navigate these forms.
Yeah, it's really easy in, this industry to get kind of, set in your ways and set in a flow and a way of doing things. And, it's important. The contract is such a great tool because really it was designed by a neutral party. And so there are things in there to benefit and protect the seller and things to benefit and protect the buyer. And the more knowledge you have about it, the better you can utilize that tool to benefit your clients.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all about protecting the clients. That's what we're here for.
Yep.
And to make a little bit of dough in the process. All right, great. Well, I don't see any, I see a lot of thank yous, but I don't see any additional questions. And of course, you guys know that you can get a hold of Lauren and ask specific questions, and more importantly, utilize her services as a TC.
Yeah.
So any questions, of course, direct them to Lauren, but we are going to wrap up today's webinar. Really appreciate you guys spending this much time with us on a Wednesday, but really, really important stuff, right?
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Lauren. We will see you very shortly, and everybody get out there and make it a great week and a productive week. And we will see you all on the webinar next week. Bye-bye.